Night at 8 on BBC One and iPlayer.
Politics England is here on BBC One at 10:15 after this morning's Andrew Marr Show.
Good morning to you. Last month, Boris Johnson said this: "I don't want a second lockdown. I think it would be completely wrong for this country. Can we afford it? I very much doubt that the financial consequences would be anything but disastrous." So what's changed? More importantly, how and when do we ever get out again? To answer those and other key questions, we've assembled some of the people at the very heart of the decision-making process. The Cabinet Office Minister, Michael Gove. The leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, who has his own questions to answer after removing the whip this week from his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn. And to one of the government's key scientific advisers, SAGE member Sir Jeremy Farrar. We're also, of course, in the final stages of the EU trade talks, and I'll be talking to the French European Minister, Clément Beaune, about their lockdown, the terrorist atrocities France faces, and whether he thinks Britain and Europe will do a deal. To help review the news, I'm joined by two wise women, Sarah Baxter, who's in Pennsylvania covering the election for the Sunday Times, and Vicki Young, our deputy political editor here in London. We have, I promise you, an interesting hour and 15 minutes ahead. Let's start with the news and Rachel Burden.
Good morning. England is facing a new national lockdown starting on Thursday and lasting a month after the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, said rapidly rising coronavirus cases left him no alternative. The Prime Minister previously favoured localised restrictions but said he couldn't risk the NHS being overwhelmed by a surge of COVID-19 patients. Here's our political correspondent, Jonathan Blake.
Dreary weather and dire warnings set the scene for what in the end seemed inevitable. A national lockdown for England, the Prime Minister said, was now the only option.
In this country, alas, as across much of Europe, the virus is spreading even faster than the reasonable worst-case scenario, and so now is the time to take action because there is no alternative.
The last resort had become the only way forward, he argued, and in a matter of days, tough measures would be imposed, severely limiting people's lives.
We will get through this, but we must act now to contain this autumn surge. We're not going back to the full-scale lockdown of March and April, but I'm afraid from Thursday, the basic message is the same. Stay at home, protect the NHS and save lives.
The decision marks a complete change in the government's approach. Some had argued it should have come sooner, but yesterday acknowledged there were no easy options.
The idea that there is some perfect time to act is a complete misapprehension. There is basically no perfect time and there are no good solutions.
MPs will vote on the plans this week. Some Conservatives don't want another lockdown. Labour said it would support the measures, but that ministers should have acted sooner.
The lockdown will be longer, it'll be harder, and there's a human cost, which will be very, very real.
This is a move Boris Johnson didn't want to make, but the reality of rising cases forced him to act. His hope will be that in 4 weeks' time, the outlook is brighter. Jonathan Blake, BBC News.
The government has announced that furlough payments will be extended to cover the new lockdown. The scheme, which was set up in March to help businesses pay employee wages, was due to end yesterday. Mortgage payment holidays will also be extended, but there's been no confirmation yet on additional measures to help the self-employed. Teaching unions in England say schools urgently need new safety measures if they are to stay open through the lockdown. The National Education Union, which represents classroom teachers, said it would be better if schools closed again and then reopened on what it calls a rota system. This year's US presidential election is on course for a record turnout, with more than 90 million Americans voting early. That's 2/3 of the total number of people who voted in 2016. With 2 days of campaigning left, President Trump addressed cheering crowds in Pennsylvania, while Joe Biden was joined by his former boss, Barack Obama, for a rally in the crucial swing state of Michigan. And that's all from me. The next news is on BBC One at 1 o'clock. Back to you, Andrew.
What a morning. And now to the papers as ever. And there are two faces that adorn most of the front pages. Boris Johnson announcing that 4-week lockdown he promised we weren't going to face. And Sean Connery, the great Sean Connery, the most upwardly immobile Edinburgh milkman ever. There's the Observer. Johnson's U-turn puts country under tough new lockdown. It says the Sunday People, there's the names was Bond, James Bond, lockdown nightmare. The Sunday Times, Connery, the man born to be Bond. And they say fears of a medical disaster forced the Prime Minister into new lockdown. We'll be talking about that later on. Sunday Mirror, shockdown, and so on. Now, sometimes the best front pages are the ones online, and perhaps the most brutal and vivid front page this morning is actually the Independent on Sunday, which shows the graph of the rising infections and carries the question, what has taken Boris Johnson so long? There's also a very interesting front page from the Mail on Sunday in Scotland, where it's quoting Nicola Sturgeon and suggesting that the border between Scotland and England may now have to be closed because of the different infection rates on both sides. Shut down the border. Now, before we discuss the papers more fully, a few words from our health editor, the ever hard-working Hugh Pym. Hugh, you're still up. You're here the whole time. I'm so sorry to drag you in again, but two essential questions. First of all, right now, how close do you think NHS hospitals are to being overwhelmed?
Well, Andrew, we saw these very bleak projections at the media conference yesterday. More of that in just a second. But yes, right now there are some hospitals, by no means all, who are extremely busy and who are having to postpone routine surgery procedures and appointments because of the sheer number of COVID patients. Now, the forecast that we saw suggested that hospital admissions daily and deaths each day would rise above the previous peak back in April if no action was taken. Chris Whitty, the government's chief medical advisor, saying the NHS would be in extraordinary trouble in December if there was no intervention. And we saw charts suggesting that all hospital capacity in England that was available, the so-called surge capacity as well, would not cope even if routine operations had been postponed. Now, just to be clear, it's not just the NHS. President Macron in France and Chancellor Merkel in Germany, announcing their lockdown measures, said their hospitals were on the verge of being overwhelmed. But
we have this very strange and slightly unsettling phrase that admissions and indeed deaths are already baked in. In other words, the numbers are rising already. So even with this lockdown, are we going to see hospitals in trouble in Britain, do you think?
Well, it's an interesting point. It's a very sad and tragic reality. There are people getting the virus now and who will do over the next few days. Some will become seriously ill and end up in hospital, and very tragically, some won't survive. They are lagging indicators. So whatever happens later after the lockdown is introduced in England, that won't change for a little while. Downing Street will hope that the infection rate does come down by early December to show some impact of the new measures, but those hospital admissions and those death figures may well carry on going up for a little while, even with this intervention.
Hugh Pym, thanks again for coming in. You're a real gent, thank you. And now to the politics of it all, and Vicki Young. Vicki, yesterday was an absolutely extraordinary day. We had been told all the way through for weeks and weeks and weeks now that there was not going to be a national lockdown. We'd had ministers ridiculing the Labour Party and accusing them of playing politics by asking for a circuit breaker or a lockdown. And then I think Friday things start to go a little bit wobbly. Then we have all those headlines coming out in the papers on Saturday, and then an extraordinary day yesterday. Just talk us through what it was like.
Yeah, and I think actually Friday, because you could tell that the pressure was growing on the Prime Minister, not just because of what was happening in France, in Germany, them taking that action, his own scientists warning him that something more needed to be done. And then within government as well, people in the cabinet. And then there was this meeting on Friday, the sort of core group, if you like.
Just 4 key ministers.
Yeah,
there.
So Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, Rishi Sunak, of course, in charge of the money, Michael Gove and the Prime Minister. And that's when they were shown data, and it sounds horrifying. You've seen some of the graphs there. On Friday night, some of these graphs were being leaked to the BBC, as well as then news emerging that a decision had been made, an original decision had been made to go for a lockdown, but it hadn't been finalised, and that is crucial. And I think yesterday a very interesting tweet from a former member of Theresa May's team saying it's very obvious what happened here. Somebody leaked this because they wanted to make sure that Boris Johnson didn't change his mind. He hadn't signed it off, and that caused all sorts of speculation. Even on Friday, rumours of a press conference happened, then were gone. And then, as we saw on Saturday, the same thing happening. So a very dramatic moment. And you can just imagine looking at those graphs as Prime Minister, as Chancellor, all of them, seeing those figures and hearing things like mortuaries were going to have to be made in ice rinks. It's being confronted with that, I think, is what made
it must have been a very, very dramatic and chilling and difficult meeting, that. But you mentioned the leaks coming out of that as well. We both know that when a really key government meeting leaks, it's because there is a row and somebody is leaking to get advantage. And there are lots of speculations about who was responsible for that. But that has produced all the mayhem last night as well.
Yeah, that's right. And I think a lot of
we nearly
this...
missed Strictly Come Dancing.
Oh, I know. Well, that was, they were really playing with danger there, weren't they? And a lot of that, as you say, is this tension, of course, because the reason Boris Johnson didn't want a national lockdown is not just because he didn't fancy it, it's because he was trying to save jobs. He thought that it would be better to lock down some areas that needed it, but others didn't. And of course, under huge pressure from the Treasury, from Rishi Sunak to say, you can't do this, and from some of his own MPs as well, who are very, very concerned that at the end of this, if the economy collapses anymore, you're not going to have the money for the NHS come next year. And so that's the tension that's been at the heart of government. But things have just become so overwhelming that he's had to act. As you say, there's no doubt this is a complete change of direction, a U-turn, whatever you want to call it. And the politics of it, of course, having lambasted Keir Starmer for calling for this. One government source said at the time that Keir Starmer was playing politics, that he was an opportunist. Well, you know, that's now not what they're saying.
Fascinating. We'll talk more about this. It is an extraordinary measure of the morning that just about 2 or 3 days away from a really, really crucial US presidential election, we have found something more imminent and urgent to talk about. But we must talk about that election. It is so important for the entire world. Sarah Baxter, you're in Pennsylvania. You've been watching it very closely for the Sunday Times. I'd like you to talk us through some of the coverage this morning. But before I do that, it's really interesting. Virtually every commentator, virtually every paper is still hedging their bets. They're still saying Biden might lose, Trump might pull it off at the last moment. It's almost as if President Trump has spooked the entire media community.
I think he has spooked the media community, and more than that, he's really spooked the Democrats with a very, very intensive ground game right at the end. And Joe Biden has been very quiet throughout the campaign, really, and he hasn't emerged that much, apart from a very few carefully planned rallies since the debate. Donald Trump is sort of barnstorming around the country. The big question, of course, is it too late for him? Because a lot of people have already voted, as you said on the news, 2/3 rather of the American electorate have already voted. But he's got a ferociously energetic closing game. He's going to about 5 states today, stopping off at the end of the night in Miami. And he's doing everything he can to claw back every last vote.
And you were saying in your column this morning that he's also being very, very funny at Joe Biden's expense.
He is. He's got great comic timing. I hadn't fully appreciated that till I went to a Trump rally myself. And things that don't always translate well on TV are really entertaining in the flesh. He's got that sort of entertainer's persona. And people his fans like that. And so what people are looking at now are not so much the national polls. Nobody's even really watching them at all, which show a very comfortable victory for Joe Biden. What they're looking at are these rather tighter state polls in places like Pennsylvania, where I am now. And in particular, people are very spooked by a poll in Iowa, not the biggest state nor the most important, but a poll has just come out showing Donald Trump 7 points ahead of Joe Biden. And in 2016, that Iowa poll was the gold standard that noticed the last minute shift away from Hillary Clinton to Trump. So
very
the Democrats fear his dark magic, that he could pull this off again.
That's really, really interesting, Sarah. But you mentioned the polls. Let's go back to the polls, because the New York Times produces a running analysis of the polls, and that is showing, I think we can see that now, across the United States, it's showing Biden 9 points ahead, which is quite a big lead, bigger than Hillary Clinton's lead at the time. But they've also done an analysis to say if the polls were as wrong as they were in 2016, for instance, Biden would still be 7 points ahead. And if they were as wrong as they were in 2012, he'd be 12 points ahead. So under all circumstances, they think nationally Biden is ahead. But your point is that there are a few absolutely crucial states where it just doesn't feel like that.
It doesn't feel like that here in Pennsylvania. But of course, you're absolutely right. The polls show quite a convincing Biden win. And the Democrats have a phrase for their own side who are getting all nervous. They call them bedwetters. They say, come on, Joe Biden's got this. Look at those polls. But nobody's taking anything for granted here, just because it's also very much a coronavirus election versus economy election. And of course, the two things are entwined, as we know from Britain. And Donald Trump is pushing this optimistic, if fake message, maybe, we don't know, that, don't worry, coronavirus will disappear. And
we're turning the corner, he says. We're turning the corner.
Yes. Yeah, it doesn't feel like it, I have to say. Cases are rising. But, that's an optimistic message. Joe Biden's sounding rather gloomy.
Sarah, you got up in the middle of the night to do this for us. Thank you so much for that. And now back to Vicki and the story that we're obsessed by here, of course. A&E will turn away patients if virus is not reined in, it says. So there's a real danger of people who are waiting for not necessarily just routine operations, but some quite serious operations, not being able to get them again.
Yeah, and that's what they're very worried about. And in the end, what's happened here is the same message as March. It's don't overwhelm the NHS. Now, there's two things about that. If we just look here, this is about the test and trace. Now, we know the whole point of test and trace in the Sunday Times, was so that you could stop the NHS being overwhelmed by finding people and isolating them. There was a glitch in the app. We've known it hasn't worked very smoothly. It was only fixed on Thursday, but it meant that people were not being told to isolate when they should have been. And I think that's the problem you have here, because some of these things have gone wrong.
Extraordinary, isn't it? Is this the same app where we have almost nobody who uses the app to check in to pubs and restaurants, when pubs and restaurants were allowed to serve us, of course, is then picked up by the system either. So it's the unappiest app in the history of apps.
Yeah, it is. And I think the problem here is that was supposed to be one of the frontline ways of stopping all of this happen. And I think there is worth one other thing talking about, which is the furlough scheme. We know about it as being really important to lots of people. The fact it's being extended. I think politically, this is a bit of a problem in some ways for the Prime Minister, because we've ended up in a situation where there was a huge row with Greater Manchester. Andy Burnham saying we can't find this 5 million. He was making the point that places, Greater Manchester and others, have been in virtual lockdown for months. They didn't have that same generosity coming of the furlough scheme, and now the money has been found.
He wanted more than 67%, didn't he?
Yeah.
And they said there's no money for that. And now it's national, it's 80%.
Yeah, so it's the furlough scheme continues as it was. It was supposed to end last night. It's going to continue, which is 80% that people will be paid. And of course, that is not what was given to Greater Manchester and other areas of the north who've been under these sort of restrictions. So that is not going to go down well. It's causing a lot of an issue within the Conservative Party, because, of course, they have a lot more MPs representing those areas. So I think politically they feel that has not been handled well at all.
They should have. Vicki and Sarah, thank you both very much indeed for that. Fascinating. And so to the weather. The weather this morning, wild storms thrashing in, cold, wet, and not much more appealing than the political news. For further detail, over to the excellent Matt Taylor in the weather studio. Matt, with a storm.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Yes, it looks like it could get worse before it gets better, in fact, as well. Another rather wild day to come across the country, particularly later on. We have started fairly damp and drizzly, but things will actually brighten up for a time this morning, early afternoon. Eastern parts in particular with some sunshine, but there's more persistent rain heading back into Northern Ireland, southern Scotland, northwest England, north and west Wales. Some of that could cause some minor flooding and widespread gales again. We could see winds top 65 miles an hour this afternoon, West Wales, maybe over 80 in parts of northwest Scotland as we finish the day and into the evening. Cooler day across the north of the country, still pretty mild towards the south, 16 to 18 degrees if you see any brightness this afternoon. And it's here where it's going to be potentially a record-breaking mild night for November. Temperatures holding up in the teens for some, cloudy, outbreaks of rain. Clearer conditions develop in the north, but temperatures will be on the drop down into single figures. And that cooler air will win through for just about all as we go through into Monday. The morning rain in the southeast and East Anglia clears. A story of sunshine and showers for many. Some of the heaviest of the showers in the north and the west. west with some hail and thunder. And whilst the wind will be a little bit lighter for many, it's still going to be quite a gusty day across many southern areas. And as we go through the rest of the week, well, here's the bright light at the end of the tunnel, Andrew. It looks drier, brighter, but with some colder and foggier nights. Back to you.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Now then, the story of COVID is as much about the ingenuity of the scientists trying to combat it as it is about the political decisions. One of the government's key advisers is the director of the Wellcome Trust, Professor Sir Jeremy Farrar, who sits on the government's SAGE committee. I spoke to him just before we came on air and I asked him if he thinks this new clampdown will get the R rate below 1.
I certainly hope so. That has got to be the aim and the objective. And if we get on below 1, then the epidemic will start to shrink and it will take the pressure off the health service, of course, but it'll also save a substantial number of lives. That has to be the aim in the next 4 weeks.
Now, the government says that these new restrictions are going to end on the 2nd of December. Is that a useful thing to set a date like that, or may they have to go on, do you think?
I think it's useful. I just don't think we can become fixed on it, frankly. We don't know what the situation is going to be like in the last week of November and the first week of December. We all hope that 4 weeks is going to be enough. And the better chance of the 4 weeks being enough is if we all do observe and respect the changes that have come in. If we do not see that the transmission in the community and therefore hospitalisations and tragically deaths is not coming below 1, it would be much better to extend this lockdown for another couple of weeks prior to the Christmas period and then loosen the restrictions a little bit over Christmas so that people can meet up with their families. Much better to do that than remove these restrictions and then have to reimpose even more draconian restrictions around Christmas or soon into the new year.
You don't sound, if I may say so, terribly confident that these measures are going to bring the R rate down or that they're going to be able to finish on the 2nd of December. Do you think they're not enough, perhaps?
Well, I think they're right for now. And I think, when you're in a fast-moving epidemic, which is changing, you just have to have the flexibility and the agility to change as the evidence changes. And for that, we will need the data that comes through during November. The lockdown is an extreme measure. No government wants to do this. This is probably one of the hardest decisions any government has had to make outside going to war in the last 100 years. This is an extraordinary circumstance that we are all living in. The lockdown is extreme. The big difference to the first lockdown is that schools remain open. Because we have delayed the onset of this lockdown, it does make keeping schools harder. We know that transmission, particularly in secondary schools, is high. Personally, I think this is definitely the lockdown to put in place now. But if that transmission, particularly in secondary schools, continues to rise, then that may have to be revisited in the next 4 weeks in order to get R below 1 and the epidemic shrinking.
You've said in the past that you think the lockdown should cover the entire UK, the entire country. Why do you say that?
Well, I think it is one country. The devolved nations have obviously chosen their own route in terms of lockdowns and other measures, and Scotland has done well. Northern Ireland is obviously in a very difficult situation at the moment, and Wales is in its own lockdown a week or so earlier than England. But it's a small country, and those nations are all intimately linked. People travel regularly between them. And it is one country. And I think the simplicity of having a single approach across all the 4 nations would have been easier for everybody to understand because the consistency of messaging and the simplicity of those messaging is really helps in terms of the implementation of them, the ability of all of us to know exactly where we are, what are the restrictions in place and what do we have to respect? So, yeah, I think in the end, if the 4 nations acted together, it would have been better. But those are political decisions which go well beyond scientific advice.
Sure, but talking of Scotland, where a lot of school students now have to wear masks, do you think it would be better for school students above the age of, say, 12 or 13 to have to wear masks if schools stay open?
Yes, I do. I think that would reduce the chance that one person, when you wear a mask, you're essentially protecting other people. If you are infected and asymptomatic at the time, you're protecting others. And I think masks can play a role in that within the environment that are schools, which inevitably are mostly indoors, particularly at this time of year, and ventilation is not necessarily very good, and it's not possible to make that good. So yeah, I do think masks could play a role, but in secondary schools, because secondary schools is where transmission is occurring now, as well as in the general population. So anything we can do to reduce the transmission in secondary schools over the next 4 weeks would go a long way to helping us get R below 1 and keeping the schools open, which I think is a priority for all of us.
Now, about 6 weeks or so ago, SAGE gave some pretty stark advice to ministers, calling for a circuit breaker, as it's called, and that was rejected at the time. What was the effect of rejecting that on where we are now?
Well, I think the transmission would not be at today's level, and it would have been possible to certainly have kept schools open, whereas I think that is a question now. It's without doubt in every epidemic, particularly true of this epidemic, that if you go earlier and you go harder earlier, you'll be able to prevent the transmission building up. And over the last 6 weeks, yes, transmission has increased, and we've seen hospitalizations inevitably increase subsequent to that, and tragically deaths. We've seen all areas of the UK and all ages now involved in that transmission, and we will see hospitalizations and deaths coming from them. So the earlier you act, the quicker that you can get out of those restrictions and the less impact the epidemic will have. But that was 6 weeks ago, and the scientific advice was clear. But these are political decisions, and it isn't just about public health and medicine. It is also about the whole economy and everything else. And those are political decisions which we all respect.
For people who are watching this right now and understand the lockdown coming and are wondering what's going to happen afterwards, what kind of restrictions do you think we will be under once this lockdown is over? Will it be like Tier 3 or Tier 3 more than Tier 3? Can you just explain in sort of relatively concrete terms what you think is going to happen?
Yeah, I think we need to watch what happens with the data at the end of November, beginning of December, before we decide whether to lift these restrictions on the 2nd of December or whether it'd be better continue them for a couple of weeks. You've got to remember that a lot of it is already in the system, if you like. People that will be going to hospital in the next 2 weeks have been infected today or yesterday. So you won't see an immediate impact of this. It will take a few weeks before you see the impact. You'll see that at the end of November. Now, can we judge at the end of November that R is below 1 and substantially below 1? And that would allow some of the restrictions to be lifted. What mustn't happen is whenever that date comes, 2nd of December or a little bit later, that suddenly the world goes back to normal. It's not going to go back to normal immediately. I think it will be at least what is currently called Tier 3 or Tier 3 plus across the country. I don't think it makes sense to go back into regional variation in the restrictions that are in place immediately after this set of more draconian measures are lifted.
We are all waiting for the cavalry at the moment, the distant rumble of hooves, which is the vaccine coming. Can I ask, what's your instinct and what's the latest information you've got on the likelihood of a workable vaccine?
We will know before the end of the year from the early vaccines that are now in late stage clinical trials, and there are about 9 or 10 vaccines. And I just pay tribute here to the Vaccines Task Force led by Kate Bingham, which I think has done an absolutely extraordinary job, and CEPI globally. I believe that more than one of those vaccines will prove to be effective and safe. They may not be perfect. We've become used to perfect vaccines, but generally these first wave of vaccines are not perfect, but they're safe and they are effective, and they will change the nature of the pandemic. They will, I believe, enhance trust and sense of confidence in where the pandemic is going. They will prevent, I hope, people getting more severely ill, and they may also dent transmission itself. So they will have a big impact, and there are 10 vaccines in development. They're not all identical, they're different, and therefore I think we have a portfolio of vaccines which in the first quarter of next year will make a really big impact on the sense of this pandemic.
Sir Jeremy Farrar, thanks very much indeed for talking to us this morning.
Pleasure.
Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, is with me. Sir Keir, I know you wanted the government to do this earlier and you were calling for it earlier, but given what they have done right now, can you applaud them for doing the right thing?
Well, these measures are necessary. Everybody has seen the figures, the infection rates, the admission rates and tragically the death rates. And that's why 3 weeks ago we called for a circuit break Now, at that stage, the government rejected it out of hand, ridiculed it, now only to do precisely the same thing. But there's a cost to that delay. The lockdown now will be longer, it'll be harder. We've just missed half term, and there's a very human cost to this. On the day that SAGE recommended a circuit break, the daily death rate was 11. Yesterday it was 326, so there's a very human cost to this. But the measures are necessary, and we will get a vote in this week in Parliament on them.
And Labour MPs will support the government.
Vote in favour of the restrictions.
Now, you are all, roughly speaking, in the same places at the moment, and we're told that a single, clear national message is very important. If Boris Johnson calls you up and says, look, Sir Keir, old chap, I want you on board, we want a government essentially of national unity, all sitting around the table, all with the same message, will you say yes to that?
Well, on the same message, absolutely. We will support the government's message. We will ask people to comply with the lockdown. But the government has to keep its side of the bargain here, because if they don't use this time to fix, test, trace and isolate, then I think the 2nd of December will be a review date, not an end date, because for months and months and months, they've promised a world-beating test, trace and isolate system, which is vital. If you don't test, you can't trace. If you don't trace, you can't isolate. It's been busted for months. Use the time to fix it, because otherwise we're going to be back in this cycle for months and months and months.
Would you actually work with the Prime Minister if you were asked to on this?
I would work with the Prime Minister in the national interest to try to get the infection rate down.
So the big question I think everyone at home is asking is, how the heck do we get out of all of this? What is the exit strategy? Now, you've said that the R rate needs to be below 1 and we need to see a declining hospital admissions and infections as well. If we don't see these things, do you think this lockdown should go on beyond the beginning of December?
Well, I think unless the infection rate's below 1, the problem is that the infection rate just keeps going back up, and the admissions go up and we get back into the same cycle. The best way of getting it below 1 is to have test, trace and isolate working properly. We pleaded with the government for months to put this in the hands of local authorities, local directors of public health, because they say, look, we can do a better job than the government system. Well, you say, sure, Andrew.
But no,
there will be no effective exit on the 2nd of December unless the government uses this time to fix, test, trace and isolate. They've promised so much and delivered so little.
The next really tough decision anyone's going to have to take is towards the end of this process about whether or not we come out.
Yeah.
I just want to check with you. You have 3 criteria: infections down, hospital admissions down, R rate below 1. And I'm asking you, if those things aren't happening, do we, in your view, should we stay in the lockdown or not?
I think we need to stay in the lockdown until the infection rate's below 1. That's what we did last time. I also say that when we come out of the lockdown, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor need to be far less cavalier. It needs to be a much more controlled exit. But I don't know that it's possible to get the R rate below 1 if your test, trace and isolate isn't working. So that has just got to be fixed. Every week we're promised better, and every week it gets worse.
Is it possible to get the R rate down while schools are still operating normally?
It is, I think, possible, but it'll take longer. And I think lots of parents and teachers and staff will be tearing their hair out. Last week was half term. That's why 3 weeks ago I said do the circuit break then.
Yeah.
So we've just hear me out on this, because half term is obviously a week. Take both weekends, you've got 9 days. If we'd said to schools, will you close on the Friday before half term and maybe do an inset day on the Monday, Tuesday, you could have had a 12-day shutdown of schools, which coincided.
Well, that's gone.
That is the price of the government's incompetence.
So the problem now is Jeremy Farrar was suggesting that schools may have to close now because of where we are. I want your view on that, because you said very clearly to the Prime Minister back in August that schools had to stay open. No equivocation, no ifs, no buts. Schools must stay open. I wonder about your view now.
Schools must stay open. It's really, it's really important. The harm that children are caused by not being in schools is huge. So they must stay open, but we've got to manage the risk. What I said to the Prime Minister in September was, what you should do is elevate, if you like, children and staff and teachers to the status of NHS staff. And that means having mass targeted testing at schools on a weekly basis. The government didn't put any precaution around schools. If you want your schools to be open, and we should, you've got to manage that risk.
So you've been very clear about that. Let me read you what Kevin Courtney, the National Education Union official, said yesterday on television. He said it would be self-defeating for the government to impose a national lockdown whilst ignoring the role of schools as a major contributor to the spread of virus. We know the virus is going up in schools at the moment. He wants them all closed. What's your message to him?
I want schools open. I think the harm to children of being out of school is
the
too high.
Circulating?
We have to manage the risk, but it is a priority to keep schools open. We need to make sure they're as safe as possible, and the government should put in place effective testing at schools. Put children, teachers and staff at the front of the queue in the same way as NHS staff to make sure that we control it. But we can't go...
You've been a follow the science man, but the scientists are telling you something different at the moment. I mean, Neil Ferguson as well says there's a limit to what we can do in reducing contacts, etc., unless we start to target the older years in schools and sixth form colleges where we know older teenagers are able to transmit as adults. The challenge may be that we are not able to get on top of their transmission otherwise.
I think that we have to keep our schools open. The harm to children from prolonged absence, particularly children from less well-off backgrounds, is huge. They'll carry this for the rest of their lives.
That means the R rate doesn't go below 1 and the lockdown has to be extended as a result.
Manage the risk. Test, trace and isolate is crucial. What we've seen in schools in early September was children getting symptoms, very often colds and flus, not being tested because there wasn't a test available, being told to go miles.
Okay, if you've got a choice.
If you in schools, capture it early by testing. That was what was needed in September. It's needed now.
Right now, there might well be a choice of keep schools open and endure a longer national lockdown for everybody else, or close some schools and accept the lockdown can end earlier. Which is it?
I say keep schools open and manage the risk.
Even if that means a longer lockdown.
Well, the longer... I'm so frustrated at the incompetence of the government. If what they announced yesterday had been announced when I said it should have been 2 or 3 weeks ago, we could have had the lockdown and schools shut because of the natural break of half term. And people will be waking up this morning and thinking, how on earth did it get to this? The government was too slow in the first phase of the pandemic, and now it's being too slow again. And there's a cost to this. That's why the lockdown will now go on longer.
Do you think that your colleague Mark Drakeford is being irresponsible in Wales?
No, Mark has followed the science and he's put in place a break. In Wales...
Which ends, he said, absolutely is going to end on Monday, November the 9th. Yes. Which, by the standards of what's going on in England, is far too early.
Well, he got in early with his decision. The whole point, and you heard it this morning from the scientists, the one thing we've learned about coronavirus is when you've got to act, you need to act swiftly and decisively, and the earlier the better. Mark Drakeford and Welsh Labour got in early, so the infection rate was less, the death rate was less in Wales when they went into the lockdown. But that's the crucial point.
Jeremy Farrar has just told us, as have other scientists, that this has to be a UK-wide lockdown to be as effective as possible. And I wonder what your message is to your colleagues in Wales and indeed in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Should this not be a UK-wide lockdown?
Ideally, yes. And I've said for months that it ought to be a four nations approach. I know Mark Drakeford is frustrated at the lack of communication between him and the Prime Minister. So it should be a four-nation approach if that's possible. It's for the Prime Minister to lead on that and get people round the table to do the same thing at the same time.
You're the leader of the Labour Party and you've just said yes to my question. Will you therefore ask Mark Drakeford to extend the Welsh lockdown?
What Mark Drakeford wants is better communication with the Prime Minister to agree a way forward, and I'm sure he'd be up for that if the Prime Minister phoned him this afternoon.
What about the cost of the lockdown? Because we've had all sorts of figures. The NIESR says that a 2-week lockdown, just a 2-week lockdown, cost the economy £20 billion in lost output. So presumably this is looking like £40 billion or more. Is that a price worth paying?
It's a price we've now got to pay because of the delay of the government. Had there been a shorter lockdown, it would have been less expensive. And so that's why an earlier lockdown would have been better for health, better for the NHS and better for the economy. But we're now in this position where people will be really worried, not only on the health grounds, but that they might lose their job. And we can't say to them and to businesses, well, I'm sorry we were late to make this decision, but you'll have to pay the price. So the government is putting an economic package in. It's obliged to do so, and it's the right thing to do.
Jeremy Corbyn, you don't think he's an anti-Semite. I'm still slightly confused as to why he's had the whip suspended.
Well, I was very clear in my response to the Commission report on Thursday, which found that the Labour Party had acted unlawfully and there'd been a failure of leadership, that we needed to accept the findings, accept the recommendations and implement them, and apologise. But I also went on to say that under my leadership, we will root out anti-Semitism, and that those that deny or minimise anti-Semitism in the Labour Party and say it's just exaggerated or part of a factional fight are part of the problem. I was therefore very disappointed in Jeremy's response, where he appeared to suggest it was exaggerated, etc. And I'd invite Jeremy just to reflect on what he said on Thursday and think about what he said, because I think for most people, what they wanted from the Labour Party on Thursday was an honest recognition of the problem and an apology, a line in the sand, and a constructive way to move forward, which is what I want for the Labour Party.
I suppose what's confusing to people is, A, they think he's got a right in natural justice to defend himself. B, what he said in that tweet was exactly what he's been saying for months and months and months. Anybody observing and listening to Jeremy Corbyn over the last year has heard those words again and again. And there's nothing surprising about what he said.
Well, I was disappointed in what he said. There is now a process. The General Secretary triggered that on Thursday, so there will have to be a process that is now gone through. It's very important for me not to express a view on the merits of that or the outcome of that. That's precisely the thing the Commission said
without
shouldn't
going
happen.
into that, is there a way back for him now? If he withdraws the words or apologises or something, can he get back into the party?
I would ask Jeremy to reflect on what he said on Thursday. I think the vast majority of people in the Labour Party, the wider Labour movement, think that that was the wrong response, and the right response was to honestly accept the findings, apologise, move forward.
Have you spoken to him since?
I haven't spoken to him since.
All right. A lot of people in the party fear that this is going to lead the Labour Party into a period of civil war. Len McCloskey has said you might lose the election because of civil war that's now going to be unleashed in the Labour Party. What is your message to all those people who came into the Labour Party because they loved Jeremy Corbyn supporters, who really feel hurt and even outraged now?
There is no need for a civil war in the Labour Party. I stood on a platform to unite the party, and I'm determined to do that. But I also made a solemn pledge that we would root out anti-Semitism. And I'm not going to shirk from difficult decisions in rooting out anti-Semitism. There's no need for a civil war. It was my intention to have a civil war. What happened on Thursday was not what I wanted to happen. I wanted us to be able constructively to move forward. I wanted the focus of attention on Thursday to be on the Jewish communities, Jewish people, those that had suffered such pain and anguish through the failure to get to grips with anti-Semitism. That's where the focus should have been on Thursday. That's where I wanted it to be. So there's no need for a civil war in the Labour Party. We need to be united, but we also absolutely need to root out anti-Semitism.
While you were serving under Jeremy Corbyn, you heard him say the kind of things that he was saying again this week, again and again and again. When I talked to you about anti-Semitism, you always said you were against it. You always said it had to be rooted out. But you never actually attacked Jeremy Corbyn, and indeed you said to the British people, this is the guy I think should be the next Prime Minister. Do you regret your own record in this?
No, I served as the Shadow Brexit Secretary dealing with the Brexit negotiations and therefore in the Shadow Cabinet. Anti-Semitism came up in the Shadow Cabinet, and I challenged what was going on a number of fronts, but I also challenged it in the media, in fact on your show, Andrew, on a number of occasions. And I thought it was important to have that challenge inside the Shadow Cabinet and outside.
It's a very generalised thing you said at the time. You were against anti-Semitism, and I've got the quote here. It's very generalised.
Oh, no, it wasn't. I said we should have the international definition. I think on your show I said there should be automatic expulsions and there should be rule changes. I remember saying that on your show, precisely.
October. We've already done a lot of work on this. We need to do more. But in the end, destination for me is a Labour Party where those that have left because of this issue feel they can return. That will be a judgment for me. That will be the test of whether we've succeeded.
Yeah.
My point is more that there was a problem inside the Labour Party that you were not publicly pointing out and aggressively attacking.
There were a number of challenges that I was very aggressively attacking, and I'm as sure as I can be that it was on your show I was calling for the automatic expulsion and for rule changes, and I think the international change on the international definition. I'm as sure as I can be on that. But listen, I think it is important that all of us reflect on those findings from the Commission, myself included. There was a collective failure of leadership. We have to accept that. My job as leader of the Labour Party now is to show a new leadership and to make good on the commitment to root out anti-Semitism, and I'm absolutely determined to do that.
Would you like to see Jeremy Corbyn back in the Labour Party?
Well, now you're inviting me to see what the outcome of this would be.
Just as a politician, would you like him inside the tent or not?
I would like to see Jeremy reflect on what he said, and I think that will be the right next thing for him to do.
Reflect and apologise?
Well, I think he should reflect on what he said. I think it's pretty clear across the Labour movement that most people think he's completely on the wrong place on this.
Sir Keir Starmer, thanks very much indeed for coming in to talk to us. Now, the Brexit talks to try to find enough common ground for a future trade deal are fast running out of time. This morning I spoke to the French Europe Minister and key Emmanuel Macron ally, Clément Beaune, about Brexit, coronavirus, but first, the latest attack on French soil. Yesterday, a priest was shot outside his church in Lyon. This is just days after 3 people were killed in Nice. I asked Minister Beaune, was this another terrorist incident?
We don't know yet, so I have to be cautious because it's not up to me to qualify this attack. What we do know is that France has been under attack these last days in different symbolic places. Church in Nice a few days ago, 3 people died, and this was clearly a terrorist attack. And as you know, we had a few days before a teacher who was murdered in a terrorist attack as well, on behalf of the fact he was defending freedom of speech and the freedom to caricature and to talk about religion, even in a critical manner. So I think this is, of course, an atmosphere which is tensed in France, and we do know that all this is also happening in a kind of ideological fight, which we have to be very firm on to preserve this freedom of speech and our values, basically.
Do you think you're getting the solidarity from your natural friends around the world that you would expect? Let me read you what President Trudeau of Canada has said. He says, we'll always defend freedom of expression, but freedom of expression, he says, is not without limits. We owe it to ourselves to act with respect for others and not to seek arbitrarily or unnecessarily to injure those with whom we are sharing a society and a planet. That seems like a coded criticism of the French position.
In all countries, including in France, you have freedom with some boundaries or some limits, because, for instance, if freedom is about creating hatred or an incentive to hatred, as we call it in our laws, of course you can be sanctioned. If your freedom of speech is about promoting terrorism, for instance, of course you have no freedom to do so. If it's about saying that in the way people are doing cartoons, are writing about religions and so on, they should be limited by a kind of balance, decency and so on, I think it's not the case. It should not be the case. In our system, in our model, it's not the case. I can understand that there are different models regarding religious freedom and so on in close countries like Canada, which is different from France in this respect. But I cannot let's say that France would be, by this law, by this freedom of expression, through its laïcité, against some religion, against the Muslim religion in particular. It's not true.
But, you know, there's been protests in Libya, Syria, Gaza, Kuwait, Jordan, Qatar as well. And Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, recently said that he attacked President Macron for choosing to encourage Islamophobia. He says by attacking Islam rather than the terrorists who carry out violence, be it Muslims, white supremacists or Nazis. By attacking Islam clearly without having any understanding of it, President Macron has attacked and hurt the millions of Muslims across the world. That is quite a common view in the Muslim world, and France is going to have to do something about it, surely.
We should certainly explain, but we should not apologize. And again, I think some countries, some politicians are using this confusion to create tensions and hatred their turn. It's clear that we are not, through laïcité, through our model of freedom of speech and so on, we are not against any religion. So we are ready to explain it again, to demonstrate it. And to be frank, when you look at some of the countries which are saying that France would be anti-Islam or whatever, I think freedom of speech and freedom of religion itself is much stronger in our country than in other countries. That said, again, we have to explain, certainly not to apologize about our model, which I think is extremely protective of these freedoms.
Can I ask you about another area where we are working in parallel, we're very close, which is coronavirus? I am sure that all across France, like all across Britain, people are asking one thing above all, which is how do we get out of this? What happens at the end of these restrictions? Do you have a long-term plan, or are we all just waiting, desperately hoping for a vaccine?
Of course, we know that the vaccine will be the most useful tool to stop all this. But we cannot know, and it would not be honest to say that the vaccine will come this hour, this day. We don't know. We expect it from the scientific information we get, probably quite early next year, but we cannot even be sure. So in the meantime, we have to take strict measures when necessary. And in the short run, we want to preserve as much as we can the holidays at the end of the year and Christmas, of course. I think it's the objective in all our countries so that families get united again. And then we will have to go through a phase of probably a bit softer measures, beginning of next year. We'll have to adapt according to the new situation, but it will not be normal life again after Christmas, for sure.
Let me talk about not exit, but Brexit, because we were told in this country just a couple of weeks ago by Boris Johnson's spokesman, he said, the talks are over. And yet they're not over, they're carrying on. Can you explain what's happening?
Well, I cannot tell you about what the UK had in mind or what your Prime Minister had in mind then. What we can see all of us, is that the negotiations are going on, which is good. I think an agreement is possible. Right. It's fisheries, as you know, it's level playing field, as you know. In this framework, which again has been published, has been explained over months now, we have a few more days to find a solution. I hope we can reach it in the coming days or 2 weeks, let's say.
Well, you mentioned fisheries there. Now, for both of our countries, fishing may employ lots of people in very small communities around the coast, but in terms of the size, its importance to the economy, it's very, very small, 0.02% in Britain and something similar in France. Are you really prepared to crash these talks just for the sake of fishing?
Well, I'm happy, Mr. Marr, you are underlining the fact that it's equally important for both of us, France and the UK, EU and the UK. So it's not a matter of, being important for the UK and not important for France and other European countries. It is in our mandate. It is vitally important for France. Of course, it will be different after January 1st for all of us in all economic sectors, and Brexit will be bad news anyway, I'm convinced. That's it. But you cannot ask to us to adjust to this choice on the UK fisheries. So let's try to find a solution which respects both interests. I think it's possible, but we have a few days to reach it.
But if there isn't an agreement, then of course the British territorial waters will be very, very much excluded for French fishermen, or many French fishermen for a lot of the time anyway. So things don't get better for French fishermen if there is no agreement. In fact, things get worse. So surely this is a subject on which both sides, but including France and including the EU, have to give some ground.
Yes, of course, but you cannot isolate one sector. We do know that if there is no deal, there would be no access legally to the British waters for our fishermen. We do know this. That's also why we would like a deal. But you also have to look at the big picture. If there is no deal, there is no access to the EU market for the UK, which I think is not in the UK's interest. So let's be balanced. Let's be clear, not play tactics or games. We have a common interest in striking a deal. It's in the EU and UK interest, and more in the UK interests, I'm afraid, to strike a deal.
Hearing what they're saying in London from the British side, where sovereignty is all important and freedom to set their own rules afterwards, it seems to a lot of people as if a deal cannot possibly be reached. Yet you say that you're optimistic. Explain your optimism.
Yes, because I think this is well known. This argument of sovereignty, I do respect it. Again, I would not have voted for Brexit personally if I were a British citizen, but this does not matter. The British people have decided to go out of the EU. Fine. So this is about sovereignty, certainly. But when you try to find an agreement, trade agreement and beyond, this is about combining two sovereignties. Both are equally important. Both have to be respected. If you want access to one economy and markets, you have to respect some rules of this market, both ways. So I think this is well known. Our negotiators are working on it. I'm cautiously optimistic, but still optimistic, that we can do it, finding this balance between all the priorities and elements, parameters I was mentioning. So again, Michel Barnier, David Frost, others are working on it at the moment. They have a few more days. Let's do our utmost to reach this.
You say a few more days, but the EU set the UK a deadline of the end of the month to change its mind over the internal market bill and remove the threat to break international law. Now, that's just passed yesterday. So have you heard any more from the British government about that? And if not, are you going to go ahead with legal action against the British government?
Well, this is a possibility because, as you know, this withdrawal agreement has been ratified by both sides. It's now international law. We have started legal actions already a few weeks ago. We are expecting now a response by the UK government. If it doesn't come, we could go further. We are worried about this breach, but let's hope that, again, in the next few days, the UK will give signs of respecting very clearly and entirely this withdrawal agreement that was concluded by both sides.
All right, Minister, thanks very much for getting up on a rather grey morning in Paris and talking to us. Much appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And my final guest this morning is the Cabinet Minister, Michael Gove. Are you going to be sending messages to the French over the next few days?
Well, as a matter of fact, and good morning, Andrew, I have the opportunity to talk to a member of President Macron's team about how we can work together in order to combat coronavirus. And of course, it's also the case that negotiations are going on with our team led by David Frost and, of course, with Michel Barnier.
Everyone wants to know the answer to a straightforward question. The Prime Minister told us that this period of lockdown would end on December the 3rd, in 4 weeks' time. Is that absolutely certain?
It's our fervent hope, yes.
But is it going to happen if, for instance, the R rate is still rising or is not below 1 at that point? Do you carry on with the lockdown, as Jeremy Farrar and others have suggested?
Yes, I listened to Professor Farrar and also, of course, to Keir Starmer earlier, and I think they made fair points. I think that what we need to do is to recognise, and I'm sure we'll go into the reasons why these measures are appropriate, but we need to recognise that we do need to get the infection rate, the R rate, below 1. We believe, on the basis of the evidence that we have, that we will be able to do so, and that from the 2nd of December, we'll be able to move back to a fully regional approach, a tiered approach. But obviously, we will be guided by the facts. And given, of course, the way in which the virus has shown a particular malignancy in the course of the last 2 weeks, we do need to be vigilant. But our assumption, on the basis of everything that we know, is that we will be able to exit these national restrictions on the 2nd of December.
But it sounds like now there is a kind of consensus that if the R rate is not low enough and infections are still going up, that'll go on. Next question is what happens when we do exit this lockdown, because Jeremy Farrar was suggesting that it will be like Tier 3, but more so restrictions across the entire country. That's pubs closed, restaurants closed, most shops closed, people not allowed to visit each other's houses and so forth, and that could go on for some time.
Well, again, I'm a great fan of Sir Jeremy and always listen with interest to the points that he makes. But I think it's important that we don't get entirely ahead of ourselves here. I think the first thing to say is that the reason why we need to take these steps is because of the danger of the NHS being overwhelmed. None of us relish taking these steps. If we can succeed through all of the measures we're taking in getting the R rate down, we can look at which restrictions can be lifted where.
Maybe the British people are tough enough not to need optimism, but to be able to deal with reality. I mean, the French, for instance, have said there's going to be tough measures after their lockdown. Can't we be straight with people and say the same is likely to happen here?
Well, I will be straight with people. It is the case that even if, and I fervently hope this is the case, and I expect it is the case, that we do exit all of these national measures on December the 2nd, we won't be going back to life before COVID. We have to live with this virus, and it will be the case that there will be restrictions, particularly in certain areas, where we want to be uniquely vigilant in making sure that we don't see a resurgence in reinfection.
So in sum, the lockdown could be extended and people certainly in some areas will face more restrictions afterwards.
Yes, but if we ensure that all the steps that we're taking now are taken appropriately, we'll have an opportunity in advance of December the 2nd to review the progress that we're making, and in advance of December the 2nd, we can then communicate to those areas where some restrictions may be required what they will be, and also other areas where we've managed to beat back the virus, we can explain where liberties can be restored.
Are you absolutely committed to keeping schools open whatever happens?
Yes, absolutely.
Even if the virus is progressing very fast in schools, you'll still keep them open?
Well, all the evidence suggests, and again, we will be guided by the evidence and by the emerging consensus. All the evidence suggests that that schools are not a centre of infection and that schools are safe, and I was reassured again by what Sir Keir Starmer said earlier.
You say that you're going to follow the evidence. Here is the ONS survey summary. Older teenagers and young adults continue to have the highest positivity rates, while rates appear to be steeply increasing among secondary school children. And Neil Ferguson has said that the challenge may be that we are not able to get on top of the transmission unless we close schools.
Yes, well...
So if that's the evidence, you say you follow it.
Well, the key thing is, at certain points, you do have to say there are limits to the level of restriction that we are going to impose. The levels of restriction that we're imposing overall are uncomfortable. You know, there are things that we are asking people not to do that, frankly, I hate having to say. So restrictions on, for example, worship on Sunday are deeply, deeply difficult for me to put forward. But what we've got to do is to try to recognise what the bundle of measures are, which will ensure that overall we can reduce R below 1. Now, it's perfectly possible to say, if you add these measures, then you can be even more certain of reducing. And it's perfectly possible to say, I prefer to take this one or that one away.
Yes.
But a balance has to be struck. And the balance that we believe is right is continuing with education in the interests of children and also in the interests of their families. But one of the things I would say is overall, of course, you can't eliminate the spread of infection without closing down the country fully.
Completely.
So there's got to be a balance, and we believe the balance is struck right in this way.
I'm not trying to be silly. I understand these are horrible, horrible choices, but it may well be that you face a choice of closing schools and ending the lockdown relatively earlier, or extending the lockdown longer in order to keep schools open. Which way do you go?
I take your point, but we want to keep schools open.
So you would extend the lockdown and keep schools open if that's what it came to?
I don't believe it will be that case, but I do believe that we want to keep schools open, and I believe that the measures that we're putting in place will enable us to do so.
One thing that was briefed out or leaked out from the government, but then was not discussed in yesterday's press conference, was international travel.
Yes.
Is it the case at the moment, going forward from Thursday, that people who want to fly abroad for a holiday can't?
Yes. Sadly, we're saying that when it comes to international travel, of course, if international travel is required for work or for other critical reasons, there are legitimate exemptions. But from Wednesday night, Thursday morning, our message is that people should stay at home. Obviously, if people need to work, they must be in the workplace, and that, of course, applies to those who are working in schools as well. Another hammer blow for the airline industry. They're going to get some more help because of this? Well, overall, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have been working hard on a package. There's a furlough package that has been outlined, but the Chancellor has shown throughout the coronavirus pandemic that he's always ready to look at creative and appropriate solutions for any sector that's facing particular difficulties.
Well, that takes us all into the area of help for people. And back in March, when the last time things were this bad, the self-employed were getting 80% of their earnings. Now they're getting just 40%. Why?
Well, again, the announcement about furlough that was made yesterday was about the extension of a scheme that would have expired last midnight throughout the rest of this month. And the Chancellor and his team are looking at every aspect of economic support, and more will be said in the days ahead about how we provide it.
So that rather meagre offer to the self-employed of 40%, on which basis lots of people can't really survive, that is going to be looked at again, and that might be extended.
We keep all these things constantly under review. And of course, the reason why we've taken action, and in a way I think it's understandable that you've almost assumed that action requires to be taken. But I think it's important to, briefly, to remind people why. And the reason why we're taking action is because of the threat and danger to NHS capacity.
I do understand that.
And the prospect of that being overwhelmed. Were that overwhelmed, then the consequences for our economy would be even more terrible.
But let's stay on this furlough scheme, because you'll remember vividly the big argument with Andy Byrne with Manchester and the other northern leaders just a week and a bit ago, and they were asking for 67% to be extended a bit for their workers who are losing their jobs, and they said, be a bit more generous, and the government didn't have the money for it. And now your constituents in Surrey Heath are in the same position. You can suddenly find 80%. Why?
I think there are two things that I draw a distinction on there. The first is that the offer that was being made to people in Greater Manchester and indeed elsewhere would have meant that with the application of a universal credit uplift as well, that people were receiving, those in the most need were receiving 80%, and in some cases slightly more than 80% of their earnings. But also the restrictions that are now being reluctantly but necessarily put in place are restrictions that go further than anything that has been hitherto put in place, whether in Greater Manchester or elsewhere. So you know, the government is being criticised, if it is being criticised, and I know that you're asking a question rather than offering an opinion, for the generosity of its offer at a time when there is an unprecedented request that we're making of the entire country, a request far greater than the one that was made necessarily in Tier 3, as you say.
Steve Rotherham, who's Mayor of Liverpool City Region and was regarded by the government as a bit of an ally last time round, says, now we know for sure the government thinks workers in the north were worth 13% less than those in the south.
Well, I disagree. And I've got huge respect for Steve Rotherham and the work that he's taken. So I shan't criticise him, but I respectfully disagree because, as we've just discussed, the point we're making is that workers, whether they are in the north or in the south, are being asked, families are being asked to do more than was the case even in the Tier 3 areas.
Let's turn to the situation in the NHS. We know that the NHS is facing a very, very tough time at the moment. Should routine and other operations be cancelled to free up capacity for COVID patients?
It's precisely because we don't want to do that we are taking the steps required. At the moment, if we didn't take the steps that the Prime Minister announced yesterday, then we would see that progressively the NHS would find its capacity overwhelmed. We would find that later this month...
It wouldn't be there for us.
Yes. And the Prime Minister made the point, I think very powerfully last night, that you know the compact between the British people and the government is that the NHS is there for you. We would face a situation by December the 4th, if we didn't act, that the NHS would be full, not just conventionally full, but every available space and every available corridor taken. And that would mean that people who do suffer from serious conditions, indeed people who suffer heart attacks or strokes or other emergency conditions, simply couldn't be admitted. And we can't have a situation like that.
At this point in the conversation, a lot of people watching will remember those big Nightingale hospitals being opened up to great applause up and down the country. Are they going to be fully ready for COVID patients this time round?
Yes, we will be using every available bed. Now, of course, we can increase capacity to a certain point. We can provide more beds and we can open the Nightingale hospitals. But what we can't do, what no one can do, is to overnight dramatically increase the number of intensive care nurses, anaesthetists and surgeons. So, and by definition, that is the most difficult thing.
That is the problem. Stephanie Dunn, who's Regional Director of the Royal College of Nursing up in the North West, says, we are fortunate to have a Nightingale hospital on our doorstep, but with thousands of nurse vacancies across the region, the RCN would like to know how this is going to be staffed. So would the rest of us.
Yes, well, the NHS under Sir Simon Stevens has a detailed plans in order to ensure that as the number of admissions increase, so if required, we can make sure that elective surgery, which we, you know, it's deeply painful, that some of these operations may have to be postponed and cancelled, but they can be postponed and cancelled so that capacity can be freed in order to look after COVID patients. And one of the things about the Nightingale facilities is that they allow a highly trained intensive care team to potentially look after more patients now than would have been the case hitherto. Okay. And again, a very important point, which I know you know, but
if I know it, don't tell me again.
But others may not, which is that you know, the argument's made, all this focus on COVID, that means that other health outcomes are being neglected. Absolutely not. It's because of COVID getting out of control that we would be in a position where other health outcomes couldn't be addressed, which is why we need to take these steps now.
All right, let's hover over the dramatic nature of the U-turn that your government has just made. Boris Johnson, as I said at the top of the show, said only in September, I don't want a second national lockdown. I think it would be completely wrong for this country. Can we afford it? I very much doubt that the financial consequences would be anything but disastrous. What's changed?
The virus has proven to be more malignant in the way in which it spread than any of us had anticipated or feared. And I don't want a lockdown. It's the last thing I want. And the Prime Minister, I know, shares that feeling profoundly. None of us want to restrict people's liberty. All of us thought that the right thing to do would be to try to balance, through a regional approach, protection of the NHS in particular areas and the maintenance of the economic life of the country.
My very basic point is you got it wrong. You say that you didn't know what the virus was going to do, but the warnings for SAGE were pretty clear and fairly drastic. So 21st of September, they told you. As over 90% of the population remains susceptible, not acting now, that's back in December, to reduce cases will result in a very large epidemic with catastrophic consequences in terms of direct COVID-related deaths and the ability of the health service to meet needs. And then in October, your own advisors told you we are breaching the number of infections and hospital admissions in the reasonable worst-case planning scenario. The number of daily deaths is now in line with the levels of the reasonable worst case and is almost certain to exceed this within the next 2 weeks. Do you accept, being honest and frank with people watching, that you guys got it wrong and, frankly, Keir Starmer got it right?
No, I don't accept that. I say three things. The first thing is that the advice that we were receiving at the time indicated that a regional approach was entirely appropriate, and that was the advice from the deputy. No, you read out some quotes, so let me make my case with these three important points. The deputy chief medical officer, Jonathan Van Tam, himself believed and advised us that a regional approach was appropriate. And just a fortnight ago on this programme, you put it to Rachel Reeves. And I recognise that it was a question rather than a conviction, but you put it to her that it would be wrong, for example, for someone operating a beach cafe in Penzance to be closed down if the virus was not spreading in the southwest. But it was the case that the numbers increased in every region, including the southwest, and our scientific and medical advisors reflected that change. Second point that I would make is that the Chief Medical Officer last night said there is no perfect time to act.
That's certainly true.
And again, we can reflect as we look back on the evidence, and we can all consider when we might have acted. The third thing is, I don't think that it is a criticism of any politician to say that they are reluctant to restrict liberty, but
these things are a balance of
facts.
These things are a balance of judgment.
Of course.
And back in September, you were asked as a government by your scientific advisors to put in place a circuit breaker, and you said no. I'm just saying, you look at the number of infections and then you look at what's happened, and it is perfectly clear that you got it wrong.
No
question mark.
Two things. The first is that there was different advice from different figures, all of them eminent, and I wouldn't criticise any individual for making an argument about what the right time was to act, but on the balance of the judgments that we had in front of us, there was certainly evidence to suggest that acting regionally was appropriate. And I should say that it's not the UK government alone that took that view. If you look at what President Macron said this week to his population, if you look at what Angela Merkel said, France was taking a regional approach, Germany was taking a regional approach, almost every European nation has sought to do so. Okay. But as President Macron outlined, the spread of infection in France is overwhelming.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not suggesting that you are uniquely kind of foolish or anything like that. I'm just suggesting when you look at the facts of what you were asked to do then and what has happened since and what you've had to do now, having derided the Labour Party of the same suggestion, it is fairly clear to a lot of people that you got something wrong.
Well, two things I'd say. One, I am sure that when this pandemic is over and we look back, we will be able to point out that there were certain things that the government got wrong. I'm absolutely certain about that. But
this is one of them, perhaps?
Well, this is the thing. I think it is impossible. I think it is impossible to know definitively. And again, this was a point that President Macron made, which I agree with. It's impossible to know definitively until the end of this pandemic.
Right.
Which were the mistakes and which were the missteps which were most serious. And something that looks like a mistake at a certain point can actually, in retrospect, with more evidence, have been proven to have been right. So I'm not trying to suggest with false ironclad conviction the government gets everything right. Certainly not. But what I'm also saying is that an automatic marking of cards when we're still in the middle of the game well, it's not a game, when we're still in the middle of this dreadful exercise, is understandable but not right.
All right. It's been an extraordinary last couple of days. Yes. From the outside, it's looked pretty chaotic with a delayed press conference and lots of leaked newspaper stories and then leaks to broadcasters and so forth. Can I ask you, this all started with a meeting in which there were 4 people present. Yourself, Matt Hancock, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister. Somebody leaked from that meeting. Was it you?
No.
Do you know who it was?
No.
Are we going to find out who it was?
Well,
no.
the Prime Minister has put in place an inquiry, which the Cabinet Secretary is overseeing. There are a number of...
A senior Cabinet Minister leaked something which has caused absolute mayhem for 24 hours.
No. Again, we don't know how that information found itself in the hands of others. All I would say is that there are many meetings that governments have and that ministers have. In those meetings, I think it is important that ministers can speak candidly, that advisers can speak fearlessly. I think it is vitally important that we do that, and that is at the heart of confidence in government. So I regret the fact that this information was shared.
If it turns out that one of your colleagues did leak this information to the newspapers, should they be sacked for it?
Well, as I said on an earlier television programme, it's for the Prime Minister and the Cabinet Secretary to decide what the appropriate steps are.
Michael Gove, thanks very much indeed for joining us today. That's all from me. Thanks to all my guests and to you for watching. Until next week, goodbye.
Join us Tuesday night for the US presidential election, as a divided America chooses between President Donald Trump